Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, we have quite a bit of news from all over, touching on some stuff that we didn't necessarily get to cover in the past week or so because of just time constraints, but there is quite a bit of election news across the world. Three major countries have, well, two of them have had elections, and one of them is on the cusp of an election. So, let's start just with Canada, because we have our Canadian here. That is GSP, for those of you who do not know. Believe
Yeah.
it, he's not in a troll farm in Macedonia. That's just a story we tell to the press. It's media sensationalism. Now he will be one day once his
Yeah, yeah.
handlers retract him, but for the time being, and by handlers I mean Vile Varangian, former War Report guest and likely future War Report guest. But with that being said, Trudeau called an election. This was the second one, and it was actually like just shy of 2 years because October 2019 there was an election where it looked like the Conservatives in the 2019 election actually had a chance of uh, at least taking back power, taking back some degree of power. However, there was the breakaway party, the People's Party of Canada with Bernier, and they were one of the big. Their showing was disappointing this election, but I think a lot of people, especially on our side, overshot them because, of course, one of the main issues that was brought up is um, restrictions, lockdowns, mandatory you know what's, and people were thinking, oh, the party that takes the hardline stand against that is going to pick up significant support. And the conservatives aren't doing it, the mainstream conservatives aren't doing it, certainly the liberals aren't, certainly parties like the New Democratic Party aren't. I don't know how the Quebec the Bloc Québécois, as it were. I don't know how they feel about such things, but people were thinking that, oh, this breakaway party from the Conservatives, they're going to they're going to have at least some degree of success. They're probably not going to win even close to majority, but they might pick up a few seats and they might make cause a stir in the press, cause a stir in the public discourse. And it looks like things more or less stagnated in the election to the point where it was pretty early on in the night. Now, of course, Canadian elections are much less eventful than U.S. elections or even like European elections when it comes to these sort of things. Like, it's more nail biting watching the UK parliamentary elections, or as I'm sure you'll see in the next week, the German elections than it is whatever happens in Canada. I mean, it's not a low population country, but compared to the United States, especially, it's about 10th population. Compared to a lot of European countries, it's less population, and I think their legislative body is how many seats between the two legislative bodies? I imagine this is something you would know. But point
You'd
being
you'd
is,
think, right?
uh, it doesn't take that long to tally the votes, even between the time zones, and more or less by 11:30 Eastern time, it was pretty secure
Yeah.
that Trudeau had secured at least hasn't lost any ground. I believe they actually think the Conservatives picked up like some amount of seats in the single digits, was something like that. And the most optimistic takes, I would say the most realistic optimistic takes were that, oh, he may be forced to form an even more minority government because it's still technically a minority government in Canada. And again, it's kind of hard to touch on and not to like downplay Canada's importance. I'm not saying that they're a high roller like the U.S., Russia, or China, or even like Germany, France, or countries like that, or the UK. But I mean, they're still one of the largest economies in the world. They're the neighbor of the United States, and they're also the second largest country in landmass, massive energy producer. Particularly within the North American context with the relations to the United States, I would say that's how it affected it, even though there's not really, I would say, no shift, considering the fact you have two more left leaning or quote unquote liberal parties in power now. Democrats tend to do better, at least in the public eye perception, with other Western leaders than Republicans do. However, that's getting. But we're talking about Joe Biden here, who has had his moments, certainly. The fella down under, as we'll discuss later. But
Yeah, yeah.
it doesn't look like really anything of note came out of these Canadian elections, except that in terms of
He,
internal Canadian politics, it looks like Bernier, who is like this sort of walked the line between libertarian and populist, more or less destroyed his career, and his party went nowhere. Now, this is the first election cycle they really properly ran in, but considering the fact he was a pretty high roller in the Conservative Party before, and maybe could have stuck it out there and tried to use his sway there, some could say he made a losing bet.
Yeah, he had a small presence in the prior election, but even smaller than in this one. In some provinces, he was polling right alongside the Green Party at parity level, sometimes, maybe a half a percentage point above the Green Party. But ultimately, this election was really about Trudeau taking a gamble that he might be able to win a supermajority. It still baffles a lot of people why Trudeau called the election in the first place, no less, as you said, 2 years ahead of schedule.
I mean, it
Uh,
does remind me of like something you'd see out of a place like Italy or Israel when it comes to parliamentary democracies. You don't think of Canada
right.
being this place that has these successive snap elections because that last one was the last one scheduled or a snap. I'm pretty sure. No, I think
Last
2019
one
was
was
scheduled.
scheduled.
Yeah, but
Um, we've
it
had them throughout history. We've had snap elections before, but
but it's certainly
I
not on the.
recall
It's
that
it.
they happened more often in the 80s and 90s
Yeah,
than they did uh, in the 2000s.
it's much more of a characteristic of continental Europe, from what I've noticed, than the Anglosphere.
Right, right. Um, I think with you know what Trudeau managed to gain out of it was one extra seat, and that's it. Uh, so he'll have a minority government again. Unlike other countries with multiple parties, in Canada, um, we don't do coalitions at all. It's extremely rare. So it's not like greater ability at legislating than he did before. I personally think that he thought uh, he was preempting maybe somebody who was thinking of calling a no confidence vote. But it seems more likely he thought he could win a majority. In any case, the Campbell, I guess it didn't pay off, but in a way, he did humiliate the Conservatives. O'Toole initially was leading the polls for almost the entirety of August and at least the first week of September, and it looked like he might have had a chance at least at winning a protest vote because O'Toole is I mean, he's a very uncharismatic guy. He's absolute cardboard. So he wasn't going to really sway anybody over to his side. It was a question of ousting Trudeau and enjoying it. Uh, in a way, I would say a lot of the public in Canada is very polarized around Trudeau. Uh, if I were to poll at my work, I can assure you that recent immigrants in the last 5 years love Trudeau. They're terrified of anybody else being in power but the Liberal Party. So make of that what you will. A lot of the electoral dynamics that apply to America, of course, apply to Canada as well. Given the demographic shift and so on. But I would say that the Conservatives did, I think, worse than I had initially thought. The days leading up to election day, you saw that their lead was slipping, and they were now at parity with the. I mean, they were almost exactly the same percentages with the Liberal Party. So it seemed inevitable that they might lose. But I think conceding an extra seat, even though it's only one, uh, is a pretty poor performance, given that went on his tour, but particularly in Ontario, you had people cussing and swearing at him, ridiculing him, throwing gravel at him. He really is amongst the many Canadians absolutely despised, even before COVID.
And wasn't there some rumblings within the Liberal Party about having something of an internal coup, trying to replace a leader and trying to get somebody else to run in his stead? About like a year back. What wasn't that, or was that before all of this?
I think it was before.
But point being is, it's not even like he has high in-party support, which, especially in a parliamentary system, would be important. But I suppose that's all we can really say about the Canadian election, unless you have any further commentary on that. I'd say we can move on to the much more interesting election this week.
Right. I mean, the only thing I'll add is that Canada is an enormously conformist country. In many ways, its inconsequential nature um, uh, essentially nurtures the kind of politicians that we have and the kind of outcomes that we have.
Yeah,
Uh,
it is strange having a country like that, especially being a direct neighbor of the country that more or less runs the world. Now, exceptions apply, but
yeah,
again, it's not like we're talking about, for example, the Netherlands, which, again, the Netherlands is pretty inconsequential. A lot of these smaller European states are, but they're not exactly bordering the United States. But even though you do see some of that in countries like the Netherlands, but that's aside the point. Now, moving on to the much more interesting election this week was Russia had parliamentary elections, and of course, Putin rigged his way to victory yet again. But not good enough this time because they only walked away with a 49.82% of the vote of the legislature of the state Duma, and there were pretty big gains for the Communist Party, for the KPRF. Now, as we discussed on our show with Vile Varangian, we briefly touched on, the Communist Party of Russia is made up of a few different factions. You have the honest to goodness communists who are more, again, would profess the Marxist Leninism that was the official state ideology of the Soviet Union. You have the nationalists who like the Soviet aesthetics, which I would say is probably the bulk of the party. And then you have the ones who are more just like social democrats. Oh, we should increase social safety nets, but really nothing too much beyond that. Now, being Russia, its political culture in general, there isn't really a anti-nationalist party, so to speak. There isn't one that would want to actively undermine Russian interests. Now, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there's elements within the Russian government naturally, but it's not like Western countries where you're going to get a Russian politician that says on a debate stage there is no Russian culture or something like that. And
right.
I mean, naturally, of course, the press was going on about this. Oh well, Russia doesn't have an entirely free and fair democracy. There are limits on what parties and what candidates can run, like every democracy and republic that has ever existed in history. It's just that Russia has the sake to at least be honest about it. And I do think that this does show some small window of what we can expect in a post-Putin Russia, because I do think with what we saw
Mm,
with the protests over the past years, particularly with the Navalny thing, not that there's major discontent against Putin, but it is growing, and not necessarily because he's a dictator or he's corrupt or any of these things that the media throws out, but he's been there for 20 years. I do think the attitude from pretty much anyone who isn't really satisfied with the ruling party in Russia is that, like, well, yeah, he's kept things stable, he's kept us above the water, but where are we going now? Now, of course, his supporters would point to a lot of his, genuine successes, both internally and externally. But I do think there is a growing undercurrent in Russia that, okay, let's build on what we have been given instead of just trying to maintain things for the sake of stability. But I suppose that's the eternal debate, not only in Russia, but in many countries, where do we work hard to keep what we have, or do we get ambitious and start to um, broaden out? Now, from an outsider's perspective, maybe we'll need to have another Russian on the show to explain this to us. I do think Putin has struck a pretty good balance, and again, the current ruling regime has struck a pretty good balance between stability and moving forward, where again, economic growth isn't anything fantastic. It's not like, oh, 3% GDP growth per year like we had under the Trump economy or whatever. It's not impressive, admittedly, but
Hmm.
also GDP growth, economic growth isn't anything. Standard of living, as far as I know, hasn't really had a drop or a stagnation. It's more or less kept. And it does seem like Russia's just in the place it has been since it really got dug out of the deep hole it was in the 90s. Ever so slightly improving. Of course, they've had their major victories abroad, such as Crimea, such as Syria, as well as internal victories, such as the constitutional reforms, which were overwhelmingly popular. And what I can't remember the exact vote total, but I think it was upwards of 70% of the population approved of the new constitutional amendments in the referendum. But it is interesting, and we touched on this. It was mainly due to the COVID debate that saw a large spike in Communist Party support because being the at least main face of the opposition now, again, controlled opposition, whatever. If we're talking about all democracies, all republics, every opposition party is controlled opposition. That's the entire
You're right, right,
premise of
right.
a quote unquote representative system. So your opponents aren't taking to arms. So well, that's at least what they tell us. But that's aside the point. And a lot of their support is presumed to be on the people who were more skeptical of it, the people who were again tired of lockdowns, and sort of an inverse what we saw in the Western world, where more the right wing and populist parties. I suppose populism doesn't really have a party, but so in some ways you could consider the Russian communist populist in the Western sense. Whereas again you had like, if, for example, in Italy, it's the right wing parties that are leading the charge against this uh, COVID thing, leading the charge against lockdowns, restrictions, and mandatory you know whats. And it's like that in many places in the Western world. Whereas it seems to be what we would consider an opposition party position just all around the world, which it makes sense. I don't think that either gives it more legitimacy or less legitimacy. I do think that we're right because we're right, and of course, I'm pretty sure you all know our stances on those sort of things by this point. It just so happens that a lot of the people who disagree with us are in power now. The dynamics also are different in Russia because they didn't have the sort of harsh lockdown that many places in the Western world did, and
Hmm.
the while there have been less people who have taken it, the issue with the you know what's is much less contentious. There is I don't know much data out about the Sputnik one, but from what I've seen, it's garnered much less controversy than Pfizer, Johnson Johnson, Moderna, all these other ones. Johnson Johnson. I mean, even the mainstream is throwing them under the bus at the point. It's I'll admit somewhat entertaining to watch when you don't consider the actual effects it's had on real everyday people. But you do see this in other places throughout the world, and of course we'll get into Australia, where Romania has completely scrapped any of these like medical staff centers in order to like boost their rates, or they dropped a lot of their requirements because something like 70% of Romanians still haven't taken it at this point, so they just
Yeah.
threw up their arms and gave up, which I do think outside of the core territories of the empire, so to speak, which mainly the Anglosphere and most of Western Europe, that does seem to be the trend. I mean, even in some places in Western Europe, you do see that pushback, but I think more or less Eastern Europe, and with their infection rates, they've been down. Israel has been a funny story, which I'm sure we'll touch on again at some point in the future. But getting back to the Russian elections, it was everything that was expected, and when people but the reactions were funny because people were acting like there was this major opposition wave that took power, where as like it's just like the opposition parties, whether it be the communists or the quote unquote liberal Democrats. Now that's the right wing party led by Zhirinovsky, so it's more of a moniker than an actual descriptor. I mean, kind of same with the Communist Party. Yeah, they picked up a few seats here and there in places that had some discontent with Putin. None of like the liberal parties won. None of like Navalny's allies won anything significant. So again, what you see, I think the main takeaway from this is the Western press is desperate to stick some sort of uh, like own to Putin's regime, some sort of like, oh, he suffered a blow here or there or whatever. But really, I think the biggest takeaway from the Russian elections is we're starting to see a very small glimpse into what a post-Putin future may look like.
Right, and I think that's true. And despite that, we don't. We saw no figure that could, at the moment, replace him.
Yeah, like there
But
was
it's
the one meme woman who is saying like, oh, it was rigged and like starting some protest movement. But again, outside of United Russia, there is no real
Yeah, yeah.
figure that you could see leading Russia post Putin.
Plus, there was a video that emerged. Some young guy in Moscow attended one of these American NGO meetings where they said, "Well, it's difficult to." I mean, if anybody's on Telegram, Intel Slava, I think, had the video. Um, Eurasian Multipolarity is another channel that I think had the video. In any case, he's he's filming this young woman, basically telling them, when you go to vote, make a scene, make a really big scene, because really, voting has changed. There isn't as much cheating as there used to be. Despite that, so you can see that the Western press is interested in continuing that old trope that Russian elections are always rigged, but the American elections are always legit.
Yeah, as if
Uh,
we're. I mean, look, I'm not going to defend the integrity of quote unquote Russian democracy. In fact, I admire them for really putting their boot down on this nonsense. Now, I understand that all countries that are more in line with us or people who are more in line with us still have to play within the system, at least have a
yeah,
facade of democracy, if you will. But I can guarantee you there's much less rigging in Russian elections than there was in places like Detroit and Chicago or
Pittsburgh,
Pennsylvania. Yeah, this past election.
Fulton County. Yeah, I mean, after last year, I'm not listening to anybody who says anything about America being some kind of an example of. We can argue whether there was enough rigging to sway the election, but there was most definitely rigging, and I think the most important kind of rigging took place with the not just the complicity, but with the active involvement of corporations like Amazon, uh, former uh, former members of Obama's team like Podesta, and of course the media. We saw after Trump got elected, so there was rigging or electoral interference in a way that we've never seen before in an American election.
Yeah, the
No,
weavers of the narrative were decidedly against Trump, which at the end of the day, that's more important than what's ever in a ballot box.
right, right, and just the gaslighting. This is how the results are going to be, and so on. But before I get too off topic, it's important to remember that, of course, like Belarus, Russia asked the EU to monitor the election, and um, they declined. So even before election night, they already put out a statement saying that the election was a fraud. It won't be recognized. No one will recognize it. Um, so I mean, Russia's doing something right if the EU is this upset. It's really like a level of cope that I haven't seen the West um, go on for quite some time. I mean, that's partly because they're not getting anything they want, and they're very upset with the way things have gone with Russia and Europe since 2014. And yeah, I would. So I find this kind of coping is very entertaining. Um,
And speaking of
you know,
cope, there is an
the
interesting dual narrative
I
going
just
on.
if I could just
Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead, go ahead.
So. Um, Putin rigs the elections, but this one was his most believable because he lost more support. As if like that wouldn't have happened. Putin did change the age of retirement. That made a lot of people upset. There is a kind of stagnation taking place. Much of that has to deal with, and dealing with the initial sanctions back in 2014. Although, you know, Russia's still mainly steady, and it's not in any kind of turmoil to the point that there's going to be any kind of radical change in Russia. If that were the case, the beginning of 2021 would have been very different with all this Navalny nonsense. And of course, in Western media, they still promulgate this idea that Navalny was somehow Putin's greatest challenger, and Putin only won because he nearly killed Navalny. It's so preposterous. Anybody who's not familiar with Russia, of course, is likely to believe it, right? These are the same kind of people that like get all upset and say, "Oh my God, Russia invaded Ukraine." Who cares? I mean, you lied and invaded Iraq, and you killed a million people doing it. Like Crimea was bloodless. So they're the same kind of people who just have this cognitive dissonance. Anyhow, so
Certainly.
that's all I have to
And
say about the Russian
even when it comes
elections.
to instability and opposition against Putin, we haven't seen anything on the scale of 2011, 2012, which was probably in Putin's entire time in power when he was of the lowest approval and actually had a chance of being removed from power. And the biggest opposition movements since have actually been from the Liberal Democratic Party, the quote unquote far right, with some of these eastern provinces protesting because uh, the Russian federal government cracked down on governors and local representatives. So,
Yeah,
again, the opposition has been coming from people who think that Putin, frankly, isn't doing enough for Russia and, frankly, isn't going enough of in the direction that he's already going. And even a lot of these people, like, they're not like diehard haters of Putin. I'm sure those exist, but again, the opposition is certainly not from Navalny. And the last thing I'll say about these Russian elections is there's this strange dual narrative that approaches where Putin is this autocrat who doesn't need any legislative body or judicial body. He rules like a dictator. He's like an absolute monarch, which, again, the Russian executive office is very powerful, admittedly. But if that's the case, why does the outcome of the legislative election matters? If this is just a rubber stamp parliament, if these people don't really have any real power, why does it matter? So again, they spin this weird sort of double narrative. But moving on from that, just the usual kvetching about Russia as goes on in the West. But speaking of probably the most interesting of the three, we have the German elections coming up on the 27th, this
hmm
coming Monday. And according to the most recent polls as of today, now this is just from Politico, the Social Democrats are actually at 25 and closely being trailed by the Christian Democratic and Christian Socialist Union, which is Merkel's party, at 22. Now, Merkel is stepping down Merkel has already effectively stepped down as leader and said that she will not be chancellor for another term. And of course, the name of her successor in the party escapes me, but this is the one who's getting in Twitter debates about Syria with like like American State Department shills, like saying, well, certainly like the Civil War is bad, but it is a civil war. Both sides are responsible for things that are going on there. It's absurd to attribute the violence or the destruction all to one side. Pretty much taking a very level-headed approach. And then, of course, you have the Green Party at 16, and then the more right-wing FDP at 11, and the AFD also at 11, with other parties such as the left-wing coalition trailing at 6%. But it's more or less understood that the next chancellor of Germany will come. The next chancellor and ruling coalition will come from either Merkel's existing CDU coalition or the Social Democrats. Now, keep in mind, I think at this point, Merkel's party has been in power for upwards of 16, 17 years at this point, so it wouldn't be
Yeah, like
surprising.
it's 20 actually, I
Oh,
think.
wow, it's actually gone that far. I hadn't realized.
She's an even better dictator than Putin.
Amazing. It truly
Uh,
is.
for, for for now. But Putin will definitely win dictator of 21st
Yeah,
century.
I mean
So
that's what he gets for bringing his hound dog to the to the diplomatic summits with Merkel. That's a real intimidation tactic that only real dictators know how to use. Now, if only Merkel. See, Merkel got starburst chucked at her in retrospect, which is probably my favorite Merkel story of her entire time in
ever
office. Was Trump just saying, "Don't say
the
it ever
photo
again."
It was absolute perfection. I mean, I hadn't felt that happy. I was since like November 2016. That was so good. He's sulking like this, like this little boy with his arms folded over himself. Like
Well,
it was
I think the
hilarious.
incident itself is not funny, but the fact that he just had Starburst in his pocket that
I
formed.
know, I
It's
know,
like
I know that too. It was perfection all around.
it's like the story would be so unbelievable otherwise. Like it seems like just another fake Trump story, but this one I actually do believe. I don't know.
Yeah,
Trump and Merkel was one of my favorite things of the Trump era. Like just his haranguing of Germany and Germany's response. Now, getting more back on track. So both the Social Democrats and Christian Democrats are in line on probably the most important issue, at least to us when it comes to German elections, which is energy policy, which is Nord Stream 2. Both are pro Nord Stream 2. You could argue the Social Democrats are even more pro Nord Stream 2 than the CDU. Now, what I expect
yeah,
and what I've been predicting for some time now is the Green Party, which is polling at record highs at 16%, of course, mean the Green Party, mean the environmentalists are the ones who are opposed to use of natural gas or quote unquote fossil fuels, if you will. Now, we're seeing that play out. I would have expected a bigger U.S. media push behind the Greens. Now, maybe there's some behind the scenes things going on. Maybe in the German media, their U.S. outlets are promoting Green Party propaganda, if you will. But that just seems like probably the most effective strategy going forward to really keep punish Germany, so to speak, for its most recent decision regarding Nord Stream 2 and regarding cooperation with Russia. Now, I'm under no illusion that the Green Party is going to take power or even have enough to be a kingmaker, so to speak, but they could be put in enough position of power to be a thorn in the side. If they're the third largest party, and of course we know that Germany is a country that does do coalition elections, however, with the way the German system is, like a center left, center right coalition isn't unheard of in a country like that. So if I had to guess, it's probably going to be some mix of a center left, center right coalition with I don't know, maybe the SDP edging it out because, like I said, the CDU Merkel's party, and I know that Merkel's stepping down, has been in power for an absurd amount of time compared to other Western democracies. Now, I'm no criticisms of leaders staying in power for decades on end. I actually think it helps increase stability, but compared to somewhere like the UK, France, US, especially where there's term limits, it is a bit strange to look at. And we're entering into a post-Merkel era. Now, Merkel was a huge player in European politics, not to downplay her role. I mean, love her, hate her, whatever. The woman pretty much ran a large amount of the continent for the better half of the past 2 decades. And those are going to be some big shoes to fill. That's not necessarily just her, that's just a position that Germany and the German Chancellor would be in particular. Now, you could say that position is being eclipsed by the French presidency and Macron in particular. And I do think if Germany doesn't have a leader like Merkel, because I do think Merkel was a very effective leader, all things considered, at least insofar as her goals were
hmm
concerned. Not necessarily our goals, but you're going to need somebody
yeah,
who is another skilled operator who would be able to do that, or else I think that. I mean, we're already seeing it, and we'll get into some of this when we talk about that submarine deal. How the European Union, despite what thin ice it is on, is becoming a very much so French-led organization. Now, of course, the French have always been important, but it's always really been a German-led organization, and we're starting to see that shift in power go from Berlin to Paris, despite the fact that it's officially in Brussels.
yeah. And just to, for anybody that doesn't know that much about the Green Party in Germany, it's hilarious. So in the German subway, there are posters in Berlin and I suppose Frankfurt and other major city centers, and it's been given the posters have this, the California Tech, San Francisco treatment, flat Google art, bright colors. So you see in one where there is a black woman who's holding a white trans man or trans woman. It's, there's a black man who he's a dad, and he has a white baby that he's holding in one of those kangaroo pouches. In the background, there's a celebratory Muslim woman with a kite and with gay flag colors. It's exactly the kind of stuff that you see. It's that flat Google flat art utopia. Um, and the Green Party, of course, way back in May, we when we were first beginning to talk about the upcoming German election, uh, we talked about the Green Party, its history. It was this party that like even engaged in terrorism in the 70s. It was extremely anti-nuclear. Um, I mean, the Cold War was really a scary time, and the medium, when it was necessary, made the most of it. In order to scare us. So, but the potential, I suppose, was there. It certainly was hyped up that way. Anyhow, that Green Party doesn't exist, and as I mentioned, I forget her name, the leader of the Green Party. She had an interview with uh, Anthony Blinken, I believe, uh, on the Atlantic Council. It was on the Atlantic Council. Now, it may not have been Anthony Blinken, but I swear it was somebody very well known, a very well known American politician. It's just hard to
Uh,
remember. That was about
Annalena
4 or 5 months
Baerbock is
ago.
her name, and yes, I do know what you're referring
That's
to.
right.
Pretty much meeting with,
Yeah,
again, some high-level State Department suit. So
yeah.
the kind of people you would expect, the kind of people who are like, why are you meeting with them this close to a federal election?
Right, right, right. So you have a really good idea about, who, what puppet regime, like if there was ever a puppet regime in Germany, that she would be the candidate, and the Green Party would be the party.
And yes, it was Blinken that did meet with,
It was, right? Okay.
yes. And also, she, back in July, visited the White House. So it's like, and she fits the profile, a woman in her prime years, politically speaking, who, again, it really captures that girl boss aura that you've seen pushed in the United States in particular for these past few years here. The kind of person that the propaganda machine could have a field day with if they became Chancellor of Germany. Now, I don't think they ever expect to go that far. Maybe in another election cycle or two, they could try to propel this woman into power, but certainly they're sowing the seeds of having her be the American client, the American Empire's client within the German system, which, especially as Europe and America start to drift, I do think green imperialism is going to be the new move. And considering the fact that they're drifting on the issue of energy, which involves Russian oil and natural gas, it's going to be, I think, a series of European elections where green parties or parties with these quote unquote environmentalist stances are going to start to come to prominence with, after conspicuously meeting with State Department officials. And you think of this sort of thing, you think of, this happens in countries like Ukraine and Belarus and countries in the Balkans, but opposition party leaders meeting with Western opposition party leaders in the West meeting with State Department officials before elections. Again, it's not something you would think of from a country like Germany, which is supposed to be a quote unquote equal partner in the United States. Now, we all know how that goes. It's a country quite literally still under military occupation in the United States. Now, what it was in previous decades, not even close, but again, who are we kidding? It's effectively an American satellite. Now, they've expressed some laterality, they've expressed some independence in these past few years here, but by no means is Germany free from the heel of the American Empire. so to speak. And we're seeing that play out. And I am curious
Well,
to see how the Greens turn out on election
uh,
day, but do continue.
hmm.
As you were saying?
Yeah, what's also interesting that came out today, is that Merkel, and yeah, of course I agree. Germany is a satellite state. All of this is so inappropriate. Blinken meeting with this potential nominee that could win, but really we don't know. It's just America showing, favoritism who they want to see win. It's their own form of it's American light meddling in in other countries' elections. But um, uh, back when Biden was inaugurated, of course, he had given Merkel a call, but Merkel, according to RT, snubbed him and was at her weekend home and decided not to answer. So I think, th- I guess we'll talk about it later, but there is a certain amount of acrimony that has developed between Europe and the U.S., and it's much more than blaming Trump, um, because a lot of the things that Biden is doing are a lot like Trump, and they're in many cases far worse.
I mean, certainly Trump just brought to light what was already
Yeah,
just being
yeah,
hidden. He just, again, because there were these trade issues for years. You have presidents as
yeah,
far back as like Clinton, Bush, and Obama talking about this. I think Obama in particular wanted to press really hard on the trade issue, but backed down very early on for the sake of his overall global strategy. Decided to, take the L and lick his wounds in the privacy of his own White House, I suppose. But Trump wasn't the kind of temperament that would have tolerated that, and apparently neither is Biden. Now you can contribute that to Biden's mental state or whatever. I think that's a valid concern, but also Biden, even before he started to go on this cognitive decline, allegedly, was always a bit more boisterous. He was nowhere near what Trump is, but certainly more so than a Bush or Obama would have been, or even a Clinton for that matter, where
right.
he had been on the more like outspoken side when it came to the way he conducts himself diplomatically and even in internal politics. And you see this today. I think it's only been exaggerated by his age and his alleged senility, but I digress. And again, it goes back to this whole issue with Europe and the United States shining a light on a lot of these post Cold War problems after the common foe of the USSR had collapsed and they'd integrated all these former satellite states of it, really trying to figure out what the common interest was that melded these two together as close as they needed to be during the Cold War. And there have been operators on both sides of the Atlantic trying to fabricate reasons to justify that relationship. Now there's also been detractors on both sides of the Atlantic saying, it's not like we're adversaries, but is this sort of close relationship necessary in our current geopolitical climate? Is Russia that much of a threat? Is Russia the Soviet Union? No, and you start to see this as countries don't necessarily in Europe aren't necessarily warming up to Russia, but accepting it as well. They're not a threat. They're outsiders certainly in a European context, especially European Union context, but we're we're not at risk of impending doom or invasion or malice because of them.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that's exemplified within Nord Stream 2. That's exemplified within a lot of these European countries starting to ease up on sanctions. Even the United States easing up on some sanctions.
I mean, I honestly think that back in May of this year, when Blinken met with, I always forget her name. You you already mentioned it. I'm
Baerbock.
sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think there was back then because the Greens were polling so strongly at that time that there was, fingers crossed, hope that Nord Stream 2 could be stopped in some way. And I think, I just wanted to say that, when the Biden administration said that America is back, I mean, what they're basically saying to their client states is, okay, now whatever we do, you're going to have to go along with it. You cannot deny us. Um, Trump was different. You couldn't agree to go along with it under Trump because the problem was Trump was asking for it. It's not the ask, it's who's asking. And I think the reason
It's a
for
question of
this,
optics. It's a question of appearance. But do continue.
right, it is a question of optics. It is, but it's also, I think, for them, it was a question of precedence. And what I mean is this: if you look at the rhetoric prior to COVID, and then the same rhetoric amplifies during COVID, when America is like on the path of regaining hegemony, it's the talk of values. The EU does it as well. Everything is values, right? Now, values is the code word for it. In a different age, it would have been the byword for nationalism. It would have been the byword for our history. So, in a sense, um, I'm not assigning any intentionality to it, but I think you have to look at COVID at least partly as a kind of um, reintroduction of let's say, the global homo answer to nationalism. Under Trump, there was the re-emergence of at least a kind of civic nationalism with some ethnic and racial elements to it, though of not really originating from the Trump administration, but more from his supporters. This is what they couldn't allow, is asking the client states to do something under this kind of leadership um, would have maintained a kind of old precedence that they had already done away with. What you have with COVID restrictions, for instance, isn't just that nationalism is tamped down. The important thing to remember is that it gives society something to do where they could bind together around a threat. Let's say nationalism already has this built in, but the ties between citizens are much more frayed. They're far weaker than in a more homogenous society.
Yes, it's much a replacement for the identities that they've worked over the past century or even longer to either
Right.
degrade, if not outright destroy, in some cases. And
That's right. And
it,
that's why they have to use the rhetoric of values, right? The other thing that it does is people who don't go along with these measures bring up the friend enemy distinction. That's also very strong within nationalism. So that I think is, again, I'm not saying there was I'm not assigning intentionality behind it, but I do think it's something that like has to be thought of. I do think there are strategists within the US and America that do know the benefits of these lockdowns, because all of this is happening contemporaneously with, let's say, we'll get into it with AUKUS in Australia. Australia is going to go into a very different direction, and in a way, the COVID lockdowns, which are more strict than any other Western nation or Anglosphere nation has ever used, in many ways, is there to set a precedent, an example of how societies will be judged.
and
For instance,
they're already also preparing for the next crisis because you see headlines out now where,
yes,
well, you see, look how good for the environment our pandemic travel habits were. Perhaps we need to limit travel or whatever, and a lot of people are speculating this is going to be used as a justification for further restrictions like this in regards to environmentalism and saving the planet. And again, all these buzzwords picking that up, people have referred to it as climate lockdowns, which, I mean, time will tell, but after they pulled this stunt and how relatively how much time it bought them, I should say. I'm not even going to say it's successful, but how much time it
hmm
bought them, I do think that they think it's worth trying another one, and they're going to squeeze whatever juice is left in this one, of course, before moving on to the next. But getting into Australia, so those planned trucker strikes did take place. Now, of course, they moved beyond the trucking industry, and you had that very interesting dynamic of, you see, we want you to stay home, but you're not allowed to stay home and protest. And like it was,
Yeah.
it was this very odd thing. It's like no, 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 you can't do your job, but you also can't do your job while saying no, we're not doing your job. So again, it was just this very convoluted narrative. It goes down to like, are you with us or are you against us? That friend enemy distinction. And what we saw is things erupted. It does restore a bit of my faith in Australia as the salvageable Anglosphere country, so to speak. Now, I don't think that any long term concessions will be drawn out of this from what we've seen so far. I mean, it was reminiscent of the Yellow Vest, and the French did get concessions out of their government for that. Now, you could argue how far those concessions went and if they still exist today, but I do think the level of crackdown that was required to put down what happened in Australia does show a regime in panic. And I'm talking about that for the entire Western world, how intermingled these elites are now. We've seen nothing of this sort in the United States. We've seen demonstrations, but most of them either don't get the numbers because of feds, are shut down because of feds, or just don't make as much impact as it does. And it does seem like that sort of street violence, barring again Antifa, Proud Boys showdown in places like Portland, doesn't really happen in the United States, of course, unless we're talking about Black Lives Matter, in which case regime approved, so that's all good. But it does seem like one could say that there was an overplaying of their hand with a lot of the restrictions implemented in places like Australia. Now, will this be enough to dislodge those restrictions or at least get some concessions? Like I said, I think it's still far too early to tell at this point. If I had to say, I would say no, but if it hasn't been a past 3 years of surprises, I don't know where we would be with the show, honestly. So I don't like to I don't even like to count anything out at this point. But with what we're looking at, it is like I to put it in perspective. I'm not even saying this in an optimistic way because yeah, I think our show's stance on optimism here, but it is genuinely surprising to see this out of an Anglosphere country. Like I said, if I mean, we saw these sort of uprisings in France with the Yellow Vests and other subsequent protests. We've seen them in other places in Europe as well, especially Eastern Europe. I think you'll recall, you in particular, the Macedonian protests. I think that was in 2016 or 2017 when they quite literally burnt down the president's office. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but like I said, it is genuinely surprising to see something like this occur in an Anglosphere country.
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe up until today, um, I'll give you what my thoughts were yesterday. Yesterday, I was thinking, the stakes are so incredibly high, uh, particularly with the premier in there in Victoria, New
Yeah,
South
and
Wales.
that fellow down under, but
Right. I don't mean Morrison.
yeah,
He's
I
the
know. I just had to press the point.
Yeah, yeah. I know. I do love that feller from down under. So um, I would say that, but it does apply to Morris and Australia as a whole, and that is the stakes are so high. The world really is watching now, and any concession is going to look like a failure to of power. Not so much a failure to lead, though that is a part of it, but a failure of power. And um, I think it would have had a cascading effect if, let's say, the quote unquote orange vests of Australia succeeded in creating some kind of atmosphere of concessions. Uh, you know, that would have had a cascading effect. And so I would say the entire Western world order is absolutely locked in that none that cannot happen. Like they can allow certain states within the U.S. to not comply. It's a more long-term problem that will have to be solved, so on and so on. But it's something that people expect to happen in
Yes,
America. Even
fundamentally, Florida's rebellion is, while objectively good in many ways, is meaningless in the grand scheme of things.
right, right, and so, but that sort of thing cannot happen. Let's say in Australia or Canada or New Zealand, which are far more compliant. And in many ways, Australia is being set up as the second Germany. It's going to become the Germany of the Asian Pacific, or the now they prefer to call it the Indo-Pacific, because to call it Asian Pacific would just cede too much power to China.
Of course,
Um,
and
so
just
that's
touching on the other point, like especially after Boris Johnson and the British government capitulated on a quite a few of their restrictions, quite a few of their policies, they can't afford two blows like that so close to each other.
right. Excellent point. And so yes, because there was that as well. Um, uh, you know, uh, uh, yeah, and you could even look at the row between America and France over AUKUS, and put that in context with the disastrous pullout out of Afghanistan, is another show of incompetence, right? So the stakes are very high, and of course, I would have wanted the um, the union workers to succeed, um, but there was no protest today, and from the photos that I've seen, there are people who were shot yesterday. So we're recording this on Thursday. You guys are listening to it on Friday. So the photos that I saw from Wednesday in Australia of people's backs who were shot with rubber bullets, honestly, their backs look like the craters on the moon. That's not an exaggeration. They almost look like they went through. They create this crater around the impact. It's really something. Um, but what I read today is now they've changed the laws. Anybody who is caught protesting and has concealed their face, and gets into an altercation with the cop, is facing 15 years in jail. And of course, if you're not wearing a mask, then you're also going to be charged. So there's no way to win. And I just saw three different videos today where Melbourne police in the suburbs of Melbourne are driving around and just showing up at people's homes. And of course, the reason they are is because they're tracking them on their social media accounts, um, as well. As we saw in the states, um, Air Authority in Australia has also said no one can film the protests, whether that's by drone or by news chopper. So we're seeing the same kind of draconian measures by the state working with the media, the official corporate media, to tap down on any kind of display of resistance. And again, it's hilarious to me that the West tries to show Russia as an example of this when it's doing it itself,
I mean,
and
if one
after
tenth of this
and after
happened,
all, more vigorously
oh yes,
than Russia has.
if one tenth of this happened in somewhere like Iran, Russia, or China, they would be decrying
Oh,
the end
you'd
of the
never hear
Islamic
the end of
Republic or
it.
Putin. In which case, I would say if you had this degree of protest in any of those countries, it would be a sign that, yeah,
Yeah,
Putin's popularity is slipping, or yeah, the Islamic Republic's
he's
popularity is slipping.
finished.
Like, yeah, it would be the first example of Putin is finished that might have some weight behind it. But
Yeah,
I
yeah,
will
yeah,
say, out of all of this, it does create, at least from my analysis personally, a very I hold two simultaneously very polarized views, which I do think converge at one point. That is, the regime is desperate. We all know that. That's the
yeah.
one point we can converge on. And either this is their chance for a great solidification, or they are going to embarrass themselves beyond belief and lose even more legitimacy than they already have. And you
You're
see,
right.
that's the reason why this sort of thing is not happening in the United States. Because if this happened in the heart of the empire, even somewhere like Florida or Alabama or Arizona, like one of these states that they look down
Right.
upon, that the media disparages, that still doesn't look good. I mean, it happens in one state in Australia or one province. I think there's states in Australia. But point being, one part of Australia, it will make headlines, it will ruffle feathers, but it can be done away with. And some could view this as a precursor to what is to come, but we also pointed out that this is the many in the string of regime concessions, failures, and embarrassments going all the way back to the pullout from Afghanistan, the British lifting of restrictions, the really the Biden mandate with the you know what's that hasn't really had any effect yet, and of course will be a bureaucratic nightmare to roll out, which I do think is going to be the next big battleground, them trying to actually realistically implement this policy. So, again, what you're seeing right now is things could go either one or two ways. Of course, they're being so forceful because, again, I know it's a cliche. It's because they're scared. It's because they know they need to have that overwhelming force at a moment like this in order to secure their legitimacy. But one could say it's one of these things that is going to be a short-term gain for long-term pain, so to speak. Like, okay, yes, this will buy
Yeah,
you some time. This will do whatever, but really, you're just borrowing against capital that you're not going to be able to pay back. You're writing these checks you can't cash, so to speak. Is perhaps a better example. Where like yeah, you can exert the force now. You can try to stabilize the regime, but next crisis that comes up, whether that's coronavirus related or not, it could be something to do with big tech and censorship. Could be to do with quote unquote climate change. Could be especially Australia with again the AUKUS thing in China. Could be a foreign policy issue, for example, like, oh, does Australia increase its involvement in whatever international alliance? Do we get involved in whatever new conflict America is trying to drum up? Again, it could be a myriad of different things, and that's why the situation is so contentious. We're wading our ways through a, of course, metaphorical minefield, which, and for in due time, very well could be a literal one. So we'll see how that plays out. But I do think Australia, despite how concentrated these protests are, even just in Victoria, I think it's a sign of what is to come in the Western world as a whole, and also it will be interesting to see as the divisions grow in the Western world, as we were talking about with the AUKUS and the French submarine and the snubbing of ambassadors and trade agreements and all that fun stuff, with that further divergence between European Union, Europe in general, and the Anglosphere, because you have, of course, Australia snubbing the French, or some say snubbing the Americans.
yeah.
But either way, Australia has offended one or the other party, depending on who you ask. Um, and
Well,
but do go on if you have something to say about this.
I mean, I think as long as we're talking about AUKUS, we could probably get into more of the details and maybe some of the ramifications.
Yes, do go on. I've been hogging the stage long enough.
Now, I was just going to say that uh, there is some mending happening, and it's kind of ironic that it literally just happened. What was it? An hour or two before we recorded the show last week, and we
Yes.
we weren't even certain it was going to become a big deal, but it really has. And France did, Macron did um, something no French leader has in modern times. He recalled his envoys, his diplomatic teams from both the Australian and from the American embassies. Uh, he also declined to give his UN speech right now at this moment. The last 2 days, all the world leaders are giving their UN speeches. So Macron declined to do that as well. Now, there has been a kind of an apology from the Biden administration. The White House did publish the readout in the latest conversation, and there's subtle clues that basically, let's say it was a really conciliatory, friendly discussion. Then neither it would not be it would not be disclosed who phoned who, so the supplicant is not revealed, because that would be the side that would be, let's say. Apologizing, or in the lower position, so to speak. So that was in the readout. So I guess it is a way of the Biden administration conceding that they had done a mistake, as much as can be admitted. Uh, you know, I was watching the French press, and the EU Minister for Internal Economics within the EU, Thierry Breton, came out with some scathing comments. He said the trust is eroded between Europe and America. Um, so they're really hyping it up, and it's not just in France. You're seeing um, Germany, uh, to some extent, stick by their side. To some extent, it's more of a mixed bag there. But no one in the EU is criticizing France's position on this. Um, it is also ironic that France, which under American pressure withdrew the two Mistral uh, warships that were supposed to be handed over to Russia. Russia had paid for these two warships from the French, but that was in 2014, and this might give us some clues. I'll explain. So the coup in Kiev happened in February of 2014 during the Winter Olympics, and of course, all hell broke loose. Later in May, there was fighting that started to occur after paramilitary groups from Kiev would go in and start shooting, yeah, basically civilians in eastern Ukraine, and of course, Crimea at this point had voted to return to Russia, and then there was MH17, which was shot out of the sky. So there was a lot of pressure, and uh, uh, and here's what I mean about this gives us some clues as to maybe why America chose not to include France, and that is France during this whole time, although condemned and went along with sanctions against Russia, um, but particularly after MH17, was still not going to stop doing business. So the ships, of course, were still going to be handed to the Russians. The Russians had paid for them, and so on. And as it turns out, there was enormous pressure from the Obama administration to cancel that, and the ships were eventually sold to the Egyptians. So I think in some ways, America with AUKUS is trying to rely on the commonalities within the Anglosphere and Anglosphere history. Um, it does uh, align with the Mackinder doctrine of that the Anglo world shall occupy the sparsely populated islands. Although I'm talking about a doctrine that's over 100 years old now, but the general idea is that it's a sea power, and it has to have all these posts here and there.
Yes, be the
And
world's navy, control global trade, if you will.
right, right, and it's difficult to attack, and these land masses in desperate parts of the oceans are difficult to reach and invade, and so on. So uh, yeah, there's that. But I think basically maybe there was a feeling that Europe and France are going in a different direction. And in the readout, Biden does concede that there needs to be an EU army that complements NATO. Now, is this like a big concession? Is Macron coming through with some of the things that he's been asking for the last 3 years? You can see that this is another example that it really wasn't about Trump, but it is about where things are going. I think also the Americans look at the Brits and see somebody that is more willing to get tough on China than the European Union is, right? So there's that. Not that there's any trade deal that's developing anytime soon for Britain. So I think the Americans were. I mean, how they did it was completely wrong. Like I said, after the Afghan withdrawal debacle, um, this is a $66 billion deal struck between the French and the Australians. These were going to be normal, standard diesel powered submarines that they were going to get. But remember, like uh, France uses both diesel and nuclear powered subs. So France has always had the capability to If Australia wanted to go down the route of nuclear powered subs, France had the expertise for that. France also has several islands and is a naval power in the Pacific, something that Britain no longer is. Um, so those are just some things to keep in mind. Um, and I think that's where the sense of betrayal comes from for the French, and it's so close to just a month ago, literally just about 4 weeks ago, is when we found out that the American withdrawal out of Kabul. Um, None of America's partners were even warned that they were going to do that. None of them were prepared. So the erosion is real. The lack of trust is real. And although this is particular to just France, you can see how the rest of Europe might feel about it. I think the Brits right now, or let's say British politicians, are really trying to revive a certain kind of nostalgia for a past time, and they're going to, stick it out for with the U.S. right to the end. But now I've taken the mic long enough, so
I mean, just
that's all I'll
one
say.
thing I'll say before moving on to Israel, as you said, in the Middle East in general, is in retrospect about what are we 5 years on from Brexit, it has really been. I'm not saying the European Union is in a good position or anything. I think they've certainly taken their blows down. I think that's independent of Brexit, but I do think that's certainly a contributing factor. But it seems like when it comes to the European Union's new strategy, having the British outside of the Union has done a lot more for them than what they could have gotten away with. Now, I wouldn't directly attribute things like Nord Stream 2 to Brexit, but I do think there is a case to be made that continental Europe is less hindered in its relations with countries like
Yeah.
Russia, China, and Iran than when you have the British in there, particularly acting as a voice of the Anglosphere, a voice of America. Not to be confused with of course, the State Department-backed media outlet, however, that's operational throughout continental Europe. But aside the point is, it is funny how what ended up being decried by so many turned out to really have opened a lot of doors of opportunity. I would say that
Mhm.
the European Union has potential for a much better future under this. Now, I couldn't imagine discussions of a European army, at least to the degree that they exist now, under a European Union with the British in it. Even though, when it comes to Anglosphere unity, it is interesting because apparently there was some strange offhand comments made by Biden on the Irish border issue that may have
I'm
rubbed
Irish.
yeah that may have rubbed the UK the wrong way. So we'll see how that plays out. But
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I don't think we've seen enough major incidences or even just one that could really declare a break between Europe proper and the United States and the Anglosphere as a whole. But I think functionally, as time goes on, as we come back and look at it, they are operating more and more independent of each other. Now, of course, they're still united by common values, as you were saying earlier, but
Yeah.
those quote unquote common values are drifting apart, so fast. And we'll see with more instances like this submarine deal, like a lot of these things, how that ends up playing out. Now, moving on to some Middle Eastern news, I want to start in Washington D.C. So, of course, there was a vote in Congress to cut funds to particularly the Iron Dome in Israel, which is of course their just wonderful missile defense system that has something like only 2/3 of accuracy, despite claims of 90% accuracy. Which I mean, 2/3, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, to quote a famous philosopher. But well, with that out of the way, again, a certainly exaggerated missile system. Now, of course, the Republicans were more outraged about this than the current situation on the border, which we'll touch on next week. There's still too much developing for me to really get into that in too much detail right now. Then between the COVID culture war, if you will, it was outrage about the Iron Dome, and of course, the most famous scene from all of this is AOC was teary-eyed when she voted
Yes.
present. And you,
Yes.
it's like you people find a way to make like being anti-Israel so lame because like you know beyond like establishment GOP and some establishment Democrats at this point, like they're really only vocally pro-Israel people. I mean, now there's not that many vocally anti-Israel people. Most people just really couldn't care less about the issue. But it's like you're making such. It's like you almost have to be controlled opposition when you're making such an issue that people feel so strongly about looks so absurd. And you could say that about
Right.
her quote unquote economic positions, the fact that she is just there to derail the conversation, to sabotage, if you will, which I think is plausible when you think about the so-called American left with people like AOC and the squad, so to speak. But you saw a pretty major rebellion within the Democratic parties within this congressional vote to, you know, actually show some sort of negative attitude towards Israel, to show some degree of condemnation. And this is even
Yeah.
like to the degree that, of course, a lot of people would have wanted, ourselves included. But it is funny watching Israel become less of the issue it had been in previous years and decades, especially as we were talking about in the 9/11 episode, how really support for Israel and their interests became this position that was spread throughout the establishment. Going against Israel was enough to destroy your political career, etc. And it is funny in light of all of this, especially after they are yet another embarrassment of the empire with their infection rates after the you know whats, and in fact, looking almost worse because of it. Uh, on top of all of that,
Hmm. Hmm.
you have the perpetual embarrassment of the empire, and do you know where we can find that? Do you know where we can find that? I'll give you three
Where?
guesses.
The perpetual embarrassment of the empire?
Yes, this place that serves as a perpetual embarrassment for the empire's goals, I should say.
Uh, I don't know. I mean, Syria?
Yes, yes, you're right on your first guess. So the assault on the Idlib province continues, with Russian, Syrian, and pro-government forces pushing further and continuing their shelling operations. You had some, again, instances where you actually had large numbers of rebel fighters killed. You, of course, have the Turkish operations picking up again in northeastern Syria as coinciding with this. Now, some people, especially both the anti-Erdogan and anti-Assad crowds, would say this is some sort of coordination while ignoring all the realities on the ground. But you have that, and then also speaking of Israel, you had a drone that they allegedly lost contact with over the Golan Heights that the Syrians are claiming they had shot down with their batteries.
Yeah.
You had some, of course, skirmishes in southwestern Syria, again in that Daraa province, with that small outhold of rebels. Of course, you have the small resurgences of ISIS, etc., these rebel groups. But yet again, the main news out of Syria is the further push into Idlib. And it looks like, although we have officially entered fall, I don't think there is going to be an Idlib province controlled by the rebels next summer. Now, one could get ambitious and say, even by the end of this year, Idlib will have more or less fallen. I'm not going to get that ambitious. I'll say within the next 6 months, Idlib will fall. So
Yeah.
by the coming of next spring, by late March of 2022, Rebel Idlib will have fallen, is going to be my official prediction. Now,
Okay.
you can hold me to that. Last summer of Idlib is still accurate. Now, that was a broad prediction, but especially after
Yeah.
Afghanistan, I don't think anything is an absurd prediction anymore. But ultimately, I mean, that's why I say this for the end of the show. Just to top it off, just to top off all the other instances in which the Empire faced utter embarrassment just over these past few weeks, past few months. You have the ongoing show in Syria where the once brave Western-backed rebels are now capitulating and falling beneath the heel of the horrible Syrian regime, as some people would say. Now, I'm too careful. I don't want to jinx myself or cast the Assad curse upon myself, even in an ironic sense. So I'll choose my words carefully here.
Yeah.
But It is interesting to watch how these people have been portrayed by as these brave fighters. I mean, isn't that just a perfect bookend to this entire saga of the past, 2.5, 3 years? The fact that the last stronghold of rebellion in Syria is effectively fallen.
Yeah, and actually to that, speaking of Idlib, the Pentagon press secretary John Kirby came out today, and people had noticed that there was a drone strike. I believe it was yesterday or the day before, and essentially they had killed a Al Qaeda linked operative leader, Abu Hamza al Yamani. He belongs to Horace al Din. Now, it's hilarious because Horace al Din has been in a conflict with HTS, Harat Tahrir al Sham, uh, off and on. And I mean, the reason this is happening is basically they want HTS to have, the Americans do, and the Turks for that matter, want HTS to be the undisputed ruler of the little fiefdom of greater Western Idlib province and Idlib city. So they had to get rid of him in order to do that. Although I don't, I mean, I think for the for the jihadists on the ground, I think they get the message loud and clear. But ultimately, it's not really like a show of support, so to speak.
Yeah, and
Um,
one could also say he possibly just, of course, now I know he was part of the opposing faction, but I imagine at some point he was part of the, rebel-backed factions that people receiving the
right,
CIA
right,
guns and
right.
money. Perhaps,
Exactly what I
he
was
knew a
getting
little
at.
too much. Maybe he wasn't going to squeal to anyone important, but he still knew too much, and he had to go.
Yeah, and he could not dispute with HTS. He had to know what the pecking order was. But that is definitely going to actually fracture whatever kind of support maybe Horace al-Din might have been able to provide, because Russia has been bombing Idlib for a month now in a very, very steady way. They did kill an HTS commander, I believe today or yesterday. There is that 7 hour time difference. So it's either in the 23rd or the 22nd of September that this happened. And as you say, they keep pushing. You look at that highway number 4. 2 years ago, a lot of highway number 4 was under joint patrol of the Russians and the Turks, and now there's just that little tiny area. And I think it's probably a goal of the Syrians to make sure that Idlib has no access to Highway 4. If they can't take Idlib, they'll starve it out, and the strategy will be to free Highway 4 on the west side of. I don't mean the northeast side of Syria, where there are ongoing problems where essentially the Turks are killing American-backed forces. Usually, those forces are Kurds of one kind or another.
Yeah, and I
Anyhow,
mean, and it's at the point, as we discussed with the embarrassment of the empire, where Syria does now have the somewhat of the latitude to do siege warfare on Idlib, because if they would have tried this even back in like 2019 when the U.S. had more or less given up in Syria, or even last year, the Assad is starving out Idlib, and it's horrible. And this is his newest crime. How much longer until he fires gas canisters in the city to, just to take out the poor starving children? It would have been that press coverage 24/7 as it
yeah,
went.
yeah,
So and they played it out. They waited out. They're finally at the point where I don't know if they will do that, but they have the capability to implement some of those siege measures if need be, and they'd probably face very little, if any, backlash. Now, again, of course they'll want control of the highway, and they will leverage that. Or perhaps the other angle we might not be looking at is they could take the highway and use that to finally broker a proper peace deal and say, look, you can either starve out, you can either be isolated in what little foothold you have left, or you can come to the table and we can
yeah.
make some sort of peace and we can put this behind us and get back to rebuilding Syria. It could be either
Right.
of those because again they've alternated between those strategies. They've pursued peace deals and peace talks. I mean, just most recently in Daraa, you had these peace talks. So
That's right. The raw is like that. That's it. The resistance there that popped up for a little while is, and although there were nine, possibly one of the nine were killed, maybe more. The others were injured. There was a recent ISIS attack in central Syria where a lot of this, where the problem has been persistent for at least a year and a half now. But even that has toned down. It's not nearly as urgent as it was even 5 6 months ago. Um, and in some ways, I think part of the reason the Russians are taking advantage of this is uh, after Afghanistan, it's obvious that America's shift is really going to be in the Asian Pacific. It's without doubt, and I think part of the reason maybe Britain was so concerned about Afghanistan falling, not just because Britain is sort of acting like this, over the top U.S. lapdog, but I think there was a fear that what happens in Central Asia and the Middle East affects Europe more directly than what happens in China, right? And they have lucrative deals with China as well. Um, but I would say that that kind of concern that came out of Britain, they were flabbergasted that America was pulling out, not just how they were pulling out. Um, and I think the America's attention has really shifted now. It's now or never, and I think Russia knows it has a free hand in Syria more than it's ever had before. Uh, America is at the point of kind of overextension, despite the Pentagon this week claiming that it controls a third of Syria. I mean, yeah, in a way, but
yeah, through
like
your proxy, but how
your
yeah,
NATO
like
partner is like literally killing. He's literally killing your Pentagon operatives in northern Syria for 4 years now.
eh,
So
yeah, and that also begs the question: once the slightest U.S. faltering is shown, how many of these Kurdish and quote unquote SDF group are going to prove to be fair weather friends? I mean, we already saw in 2019 when they entered into open negotiations with the Syrian government, or it was 2018,
yeah,
2019 when that happened. Now, that got
yeah,
shut down upon another further siege on Idlib, but I mean, once Idlib is taken care of, once the bulk of the armed resistance is taken care of, at that point, it's going to look like a pretty attractive
yes,
deal for the SDF, especially controlling an area that is 90% Arab, because that yellow, while under Kurdish control, the vast majority of the people there are not Kurdish. They are
that's
Syrians, they
right,
are Arabs. And the pressure
that's
is
right,
going to be immense to finally come to the table. Now, I'm sure there'll be some
right.
agreements, some concessions on both sides, but at that point, especially with your ever decreasing U.S. support and ever increasing Turkish pressures, what other options do you have besides that, or fighting until the bitter end? In which case, I mean, at what cost? And again, how many of the people that you currently rule over, that your groups currently rule over, are going to be loyal to what are fundamentally Kurdish ethno-nationalists? Why would you be loyal to a foreign ethnic group
Mhm.
ruling over your people who have pretty much outright stated their intent that we want to create a state here at your expense?
Right, right. And so for Turkey, if Turkey loses Idlib, and there's been some very strong language emanating out of Turkey, basically saying we're going to have to attack the U.S. The U.S. is misbehaving. It's not respecting our wishes. We don't want the U.S. troops or Russian troops next to our border. It was a former minister who was saying this. So very, very strong language
You think they'll bring back out the
emanate.
Ottoman slap line?
Well, I mean, I think that I think the increase for troops in Syria happened in the first place because, um, well, I mean, one was to counter Trump because he stopped funding for many of the jihadists slash terrorists in Syria. But the other reason is the Kurds were making negotiations with Assad. And so that forced America to go in there and say, no, 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 don't make any concessions with Assad. We'll protect you. And you can see they can't protect them because protecting them would mean going to war with Turkey. And they're not willing to do that because, the boss first and all that. But So you're right. If Idlib falls, all that's left are like America will have to reinvigorate ISIS in a very, very big way. And this
On
is
top
while
of all the other fires that they are in charge of putting out,
right,
Syria might just very well fall to the wayside. It might just be a concession they're willing to make because, I mean, internally, number one, East Asia, I would say number two, possibly tied, if not in number three, the situation in Europe. At that point, it's like Syria is probably like five or six on the priority list at that point, because I'm almost certain that I mean I'm there's probably more vital interest to the American Empire in Latin America than Syria at this point. And when it comes
mm,
to especially walking that line with the Turkey issue, they're not going to want to piss off Turkey in any sense. That situation's already fragile enough as it is to the point where, I mean, it could just be, as you said, as the Pentagon disputed overextension. And I mean, even the people who rallied around the Kurds when Trump allegedly betrayed them,
yeah,
how many of them are going to care about the U.S. or Biden especially banning the Kurds when you have your Trump voting neighbor who's skeptical of the what still walking as a free man? Like perhaps I apply a bit of exaggeration here, but or when you have again various of these other issues or mounting economic problems in the U.S. Syria is not going to be able to be the kind of concern it was in 2013, 2014, 2015, or even in 2018 for that matter. The point where,
yeah,
I mean, maybe I'm premature and I hope I'm not jinxing it, but I mean, this is more or less 2021 is the year Assad has achieved an uncontested victory. Who is left to oppose him? Who is left
yeah,
to realistically put in the effort
yeah,
to oppose the Syrian regime? No one. Nobody's
yeah,
going to do it. The Arabs in the Gulf have given up. Israel has more or less given up. I mean, even their amount of strikes have decreased. America and NATO have given up. Russia is behind Syria. China is behind Syria. Turkey has given up. There is, I mean, Turkey's main concern, and I think Turkey at this point would welcome a Syrian government control of the Kurdish areas because
oh yeah,
they wouldn't tolerate YPG, PKK, SDF, whatever the hell they wouldn't tolerate their nonsense as they had before.
hmm
Now there'd
hmm
be some parlaying, there'd be some concessions, maybe they'll get some political representation, whatever, but they're not going to be the sort of armed group they've been for the past 5-6 years on the Turkish border.
right. And I would say Erdogan's strategy is to try to support his forces that have invaded the northern part of Syria in the so-called Kurdish territories, and at the same time support Idlib. Now he's not doing like a real bang-up job on supporting Idlib right now, but that's more that he can't, not rather than he wouldn't want to, um, or has decided not to. The reason I say this is because um, like I said earlier, if Idlib is out of the picture and all that's left is American occupying eastern Syria, uh, and ISIS is more or less easily contained. If that's the case, right? The only dispute now is between the Turks and the Kurds north of the Euphrates. That's it.
I'll just throw a fun little question your way. Who do you think
And he can't he
Assad?
can't afford he can't afford that. Like
Oh,
if
certainly not.
if it comes down to a single issue, he can't pivot. He can't rebalance, right? That he no longer has this seesaw where like, okay, well, you can't get too hard on me in what I'm doing in northern Syria and in eastern Syria because, well, I mean, I'm supporting Idlib because if Idlib goes, in a way, America has very little use for him.
Oh yeah, that's like the number one bargaining chip, and this will play into my question I'm going to throw to you. And you already have John Bolton co-agitating against Erdogan's government and trying to find some sort of
Yep.
replacement with it with their new NGO. But who do you think Assad haunts the dreams of more when they lay down their head to rest at night? Erdogan or Bolton? It's just like the epitome of their failures. I would honestly say Erdogan at this point. Like, this was supposed
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
like Turkey's big breakthrough back onto the world stage, proving that Turkey is a serious player that isn't just a member state of NATO. And the point where because like Bolton, he can go he can go start his NGO and do whatever. Whereas Erdogan has to live with the consequences and, dare I say, even cooperate with Assad
hmm
for his country's own interest. And it's wild to see all of this play out. And I think the final thing we can say about this and the show in general, I don't know if he's actually gotten it or whatever, but at least in a metaphorical and spiritual sense, Assad is an anti-vaxxer.
Yes, that's right.
Well, he is the original. He is the original
He
COVID
really is.
skeptic.
He's a doctor too. I'm sorry, but I trust him more than I don't know Fauci.
Yeah, I trust the experts. Okay, I trust the experts. Doctor Bashar al-Assad. But
Thank you, Dr. Assad.
that is all I had for today. If you have anything else, you can certainly add that on. But if not, I can go ahead and bring this to an end.
All I'll say is maybe we'll touch it on it next week, but the Houthis are making major gains in Yemen right now.
Yet,
Major gains.
ooh, yeah,
Marib is still not taken, but let's say that starts to go really sour for the Saudis and for the U.S. who back the Saudis. Uh, who knows? Who knows? We'll just have to wait
like
and see.
I mean, yet again, that's another thing that the American empire has to contend with. They've more or less given up on Yemen, even towards the tail end of the Trump term. Once, you know, Mohammed bin Salman made those comments about the Houthis being worthy of being called true Arabs and brave fighters, it was more or less over at that
Yeah,
point. But I mean,
yeah,
the fact that they are still continuing to press on, I mean, just looking at all of this, it's like the American Empire is in. I think maybe it's because we're living through it. A lot of people can't see it. I mean, but we have to be like 1986, 1987 Soviet Union at this point, don't we? Like, at
yeah.
least.
Yeah, or as Race Borzoi puts it, America is more like the Ottoman Empire rather than
Yeah,
Rome,
yeah, fair. That is,
which I think is actually more apt.
yeah, especially
It's
like
in,
getting in the
it's in,
demographic questions, and funny enough,
yeah,
just coming off talking about Turkey here, but um, yeah, it is, and it does resemble that late Ottoman decline as well. I mean, I suppose the only
yeah.
thing that's missing is a major war to crumble our empire, which at this rate, who knows? I don't think there's the capital for that, but I mean, I guess we'll see, and you know, it is really just looking at all of this and finishing off with Syria and the Middle East, and with that news about the Houthis, like, and yeah, I mean, the Houthis probably have to be like in the double digits of concern when it comes to all those things we listed there. But
Hmm.
I mean, imagine trying to explain this to a bright-eyed Obama in 2009. And just the look of shock and disgust on his face. That's what gets me through the day sometimes, thinking about like what do you think people like Obama, people like John McCain, who's now currently in where, are just lamenting about this project that they dedicated their entire lives to. Especially them both being glow in the dark, so to speak, and their family connections. But
Yeah.
I think I'm getting too far off the beaten path, and I suppose we'll bring this episode to an end before we cross the hour 40 mark. So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We hope to see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.